Hey, it's Mrs. Sobach here to talk about the Constitutional Convention. So, in May of 1787, 55 delegates from 12 of the 13 states, so Rhode Island was the only one not there, attended the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia to consider amending the Articles of Confederation. This is really important that they were only planning to be there to fix the articles or change them. They were not planning to do anything else. They met in the same room in Philadelphia where 11 years earlier the Declaration of Independence had been debated. James Madison took the most notes at the convention, and he would eventually go on to write most of the Constitution, which is why we call him the father of the Constitution. So the delegates who attended the convention were members of the country's social, economic, and political elite. If you're elite, it means that you are powerful. You're the top, the best. So these are the people with the money, the power, the political power. Many of them had been members of the Continental Congress back when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. Every single one of them is white. Every single one of them is male. Almost all of them are wealthy. Half of them are lawyers. More than half of them own slaves. Some of them probably were lawyers who owned slaves. And so because of that, you have to think about this, that as the men at the Constitutional Convention were primarily white and wealthy, this meant that they were more concerned with the issues that impacted them personally, and they didn't focus on issues that might have impacted other groups of people. So even though Shays' Rebellion was partly to blame for the convention, these issues related to debt would be decided later when Washington became president. They don't do anything about it at the Constitutional Convention. So a few important words for you to know. You're going to want to write these definitions down in your notes. The men who wrote the Constitution are referred to by several different names. So these three names are really talking about the same group of people. We have the word delegates. A delegate means that they're a representative that's sent to a conference, meaning they're chosen to represent somebody else's point of view. We've got the framers, a person who shapes a concept or a plan. That does not say farmers. Framers. The framers are the men who frame the Constitution or create that plan. And then sometimes we call them the founding fathers. This is a term given to the men who wrote the Constitution, but also for men who are involved in the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress, anything like that. So at the Constitutional Convention, there was kind of two big issues. The first one is the issue of representation. So the men who wrote the Constitution were very concerned with how the states would be represented in the national government. The more votes a state had in the government, the more power they would hold in guiding the direction of the country. Large states felt that they should have more votes because they had a larger population. Smaller states felt that each state should be represented equally and have an equal vote. And so they fight over that. In fact, they fight over it so much that the convention almost ends. The Virginia plan was representing the large states. They believed that the power of the government would be spread among three branches, that there would be an executive branch to enforce the laws, a legislative branch to make the laws, and a judicial branch to judge or interpret the laws. That part doesn't get argued about. It's this next part that they fight over. So the Virginia plan says that there would be two sections of the legislative branch, that it would have a Senate and a House of Representatives. And in both of those houses, the number of representatives that each state would get would be based on the population of that state. So the states that had more people living in them would have more representatives, and the states that had fewer people living in them would have fewer representatives. The New Jersey plan represented the small states, and it was the opposite. They believed that there should be only one house in the legislative branch, and that in that one house, each state should have only one vote, meaning that they are completely equal. They almost end the Constitutional Convention over this issue, but luckily they're able to come to a compromise, and they call it the Great Compromise because it's so big. So they agree that there will be three branches of power in the government, that there would be two houses in the legislative branch that makes the laws. One of those houses would be the Senate, one would be the House of Representatives. And then here's where you can really see the compromise, that they would use the Virginia plan for part of those and the New Jersey plan for part. So the Senate would have two representatives per state, meaning that the Senate is completely equal, and that the House of Representatives would have representation based on population. So bigger states would have more votes. This is the plan that we use today. The second issue that's going on in the Constitutional Convention is the issue of slavery and how are we going to count slaves. The men who wrote the Constitution were concerned with how slavery would be considered. Northern states had increasingly begun to outlaw slavery, while Southern slave owners wanted the new Constitution to protect slavery. So in this case, we have Northern and Southern kind of disagreeing. The Northern argument said that slaves should count as property for taxation purposes and that slaves should not count as population. They wanted the South to have to pay more taxes, but they didn't want the South to get more representatives. The Northern argument also said that the national government should set a date to outlaw the international slave trade. They said that bringing in slaves from other countries was wrong and that we should get rid of that. The Southern argument was the opposite. The Southerners believed that slaves should count as part of the population for determining the number of representatives that their state would have in the House of Representatives. Because of those slaves, they would get more votes, they believed. They believed that slaves should not count as property for taxation purposes, because they didn't want to have to pay more money. And the Southerners believed that the national government should help the Southerners catch any slaves who might run away. So they meet in the middle, they compromise, and they come up with something called the 3/5 compromise. In the 3/5 compromise, each slave would count as 3/5 of a person for taxation and representation. That meant that every 5,000 slaves would count as 3,000 persons, and that they would have to pay taxes, that the Southerners would have to pay taxes on those slaves, but that the Southerners would also get increased representation because of those enslaved people. They also included in the Constitution a requirement that the importation of new slaves from Africa would end by the year 1808. They choose that year because it gives them 20 years to end that importation. So you might be confused by this compromise because obviously it's really unfair to the people who were in slavery. The people who owned them gained power with this compromise. Remember, though, that more than half of the men at the convention were slave owners, and there weren't many men there advocating on behalf of the people who were in slavery. Those voices weren't represented. Luckily, our Constitution is a flexible document, and they're able to take on those issues later. All right, thanks for watching. That's the Constitutional Convention in a nutshell.